Hearts pounding, I froze when I saw my daughter sitting alone at the kitchen table, her small hands folded in her lap, while laughter and music echoed from the living room where the birthday party was happening. She looked up at me with wide, confused eyes, still clutching the hem of her simple cream-colored dress, as if trying to smooth it enough to be accepted. My 8-year-old had been told her outfit wasn't nice enough for the other children, so they banished her to the kitchen like she was an embarrassment. I'll never forget the way her cheeks flushed pink, not from play or joy, but from humiliation, while the other kids ran around with balloons and cake. In that moment, something in me broke, and something else hardened. I wanted to scream, to storm in and drag her out of that house, but I knew this wasn't about one party. This was about the way people had been treating us for years, quietly making us feel less than, as though our worth could be measured by fabric or by money. So I stood there, my hand on the door frame, thinking of every time I had smiled and stayed, silent when I should have defended us. That day, watching my daughter wipe at her tears with the back of her little hand, I knew silence was over. I walked into that kitchen, crouched down beside her, and asked softly what happened. Though I already knew. Between shaky breaths, she whispered, "They said I couldn't play because my dress isn't pretty like theirs." Her words cut deeper than any insult ever thrown at me. I hugged her tight, and while I was holding her, I replayed in my mind how many times I had swallowed humiliation to keep peace with people who thought they were better than us. At family gatherings, at school events, even in conversations with other parents who measured worth by brands and appearances. My daughter was 8, and already she had tasted the cruelty of exclusion that I had been enduring as an adult for years. I kissed her hair, straightened up, and walked toward the living room. The music was too loud, the parents too busy with their glasses of wine and stage smiles to notice me at first. But when I cleared my throat and the room quieted just slightly, every pair of eyes turned toward me. And in that moment, standing there with my daughter's tears still wet on my shoulder, I made a decision that would change the way they looked at us forever. I didn't shout. I didn't create a scene the way they probably expected if I ever dared to speak up. I just stood there, taking in the sight of polished dresses, little girls with bows and curls bouncing as they twirled, and the proud smiles of parents who had spent more money on this one afternoon than I had on an entire month of groceries. They were so wrapped up in their little bubble of superiority that none of them even considered how it might feel to single out one child and mark her as less worthy. My daughter, my blood. I glanced around at the carefully decorated living room, the pastel balloons, the pristine cake with glittery candles, and I thought about how many times I had been invited to these things out of obligation, not out of kindness. Always the outsider, tolerated but never embraced. My husband used to tell me I was imagining it, that I was too sensitive, that people don't think that way anymore. But here it was, laid bare in front of me, an 8-year-old shunned because she didn't sparkle enough to match their standard. And suddenly I remembered all the small humiliations I had endured in silence, the way my in-laws sneered at our modest home, the way other mothers whispered when I dropped my daughter off at school without designer bags on my arm, the times I was passed over for promotions at work because I didn't fit the image. I realized that if I didn't fight for her right now, she would grow up thinking this was normal, that she should accept being shoved aside, that her worth depended on her clothes or her family name. I wouldn't let her carry my scars. I turned to the hostess, a woman with perfect curls and a smile sharp enough to cut glass, and I asked her calmly, "Did you send my daughter to the kitchen because of her dress?" She blinked, startled, then laughed lightly as though it were nothing, as though humiliating an 8-year-old could be brushed off as a silly misunderstanding. "Oh, don't be dramatic," she said, waving her manicured hand. The other, "Children just wanted to play without distractions." My daughter was a distraction. That was the story they were telling. I felt heat rise in my chest, but my voice stayed steady when I replied, "No, what you did was cruel. You don't exile a child at a party because she doesn't fit your aesthetic. This isn't a fashion show. It's supposed to be a celebration." I could see a few of the other parents shift uncomfortably in their seats, eyes darting between me and the hostess, realizing that I wasn't going to let it go. And in that second, for the first time, I felt a shift inside me. I wasn't just defending my daughter. I was reclaiming every moment I had stayed quiet, every insult I had swallowed, and I promised myself, right there in that pastel-decorated living room, that this would be the last time anyone made us feel small without consequences. The hostess's smirk faltered, just slightly, and she adjusted her pearl necklace as if that could somehow shield her from the weight of my words. A few of the parents gave each other nervous looks, but none of them spoke up to defend me or my daughter. That silence was louder than any insult. It told me exactly where their loyalties lay. And it wasn't with compassion. My little girl had crept into the doorway by then, her small frame leaning against the wall, still unsure if she was allowed to join the others. I saw her eyes dart from the cake to the balloons to the circle of girls whispering about her dress, and my heart clenched. Children can be cruel, but children also learn cruelty from somewhere. They were just mimicking what their parents taught them. I reached out my hand to her, and when she slipped her fingers into mine, I felt how cold they were. She shouldn't have been cold at a birthday party filled with warmth and laughter. She should have been glowing like the rest of them. I pulled her closer to me and said, clearly enough for everyone to hear, "You don't need their approval. Sweetheart, you shine brighter than anyone in this room, and don't you ever forget it." The hostess gave a brittle laugh, trying to brush it off again, but her eyes betrayed her irritation. She didn't like being challenged. She especially didn't like being challenged by someone she thought was beneath her. I met her gaze and held it, not backing down, not softening the edges of my words like I used to. For years, I had been conditioned to believe that politeness was survival, that biting my tongue kept the peace. But standing there, holding my daughter's trembling hand, I realized politeness was just another way they controlled us, another way they made sure we stayed quiet while they got to decide who was worthy. And I was done playing that role. I turned toward the door, fully prepared to walk out and never look back. But before I left, I added one last thing. If you think excluding a child makes you look powerful, all it really shows is how small you are. And one day, everyone here will remember this moment. Not the balloons, not the cake, not even the gifts, but how you treated an 8-year-old who deserved better. And with that, I walked out, my daughter's hand clutched firmly in mine, feeling the air shift behind me, the uneasy murmurs of parents who knew they had just witnessed something they couldn't ignore. When we stepped outside into the cool air, my daughter finally let the tears fall, her little shoulders shaking as she tried to hide her face against my side. I knelt down in front of her, brushing her hair back gently, and told her she never had to be ashamed of who she was. Not for clothes, not for money, not for anything. I promised her that the world was full of people who would try to measure her worth against shallow things, but none of them mattered as long as she knew her value came from inside. She nodded through her sobs, and I kissed her forehead, silently vowing to turn this painful day into something that would shape her strength instead of her shame. On the way home, I kept thinking about the parents' faces as I spoke. How some of them avoided eye contact, how a few looked uncomfortable, maybe even guilty. It made me realize that they all knew what was happening was wrong, but silence was easier for them. That was the poison I had swallowed for years. Silence. And I decided then that my silence would become their discomfort. That night, I sat down at the kitchen table after tucking my daughter into bed and pulled out my laptop. I wrote every detail of what had happened, word for word, without embellishment. I wrote about my daughter's tears, the way the hostess had laughed, the way the children repeated the cruelty of their parents. I didn't name names at first, but I knew if it came to it, I would. My hands trembled as I typed, but it wasn't fear. It was fury, steady and clear. I wasn't writing for revenge, not yet. I was writing to make sure there would be a record, proof that this wasn't just in my head, that my daughter's pain was real. When I closed the laptop, I felt lighter, but I also knew this wasn't over. People like that didn't change because of one confrontation. They needed to be reminded that the people they look down on can also be the ones who stand tallest, and I was ready to make them see that. The next morning, I dressed my daughter in her favorite blue sundress and braided her hair while she sat quietly on the stool, still shaken but trying to be brave. As I tied the last ribbon, she asked in a small voice, "Mom, why don't they like me?" My heart twisted at the question, and I told her, "It's not that they don't like you, sweetheart. It's that they don't even see you. They only see themselves and how they want the world to look at them. That's their weakness, not yours." She nodded, though I could tell she was still struggling to understand, because no child should have to make sense of cruelty at 8 years old. I walked her to school that day with my head held higher than ever before. Some of the same parents from the party were there dropping off their kids, whispering behind their sunglasses, pretending not to look at me. But I looked directly at them, and for once, it was them who lowered their eyes. They weren't used to being confronted, and they certainly weren't used to someone refusing to play the part of quiet, grateful outsider. Later that week, I received a message from the hostess, polite on the surface, but dripping with condescension, saying she hoped there were no hard feelings, and that children can be sensitive. That was the moment I decided it was time for something more than words. I had been sitting on a truth for years, something her perfect world didn't know about, and something I had stayed silent on because I didn't want to stir up trouble. But now I realized trouble was exactly what they deserved. My husband had once worked for her husband's company, and I knew things that weren't meant for public ears. Things they had assumed I would never dare to speak about. And maybe before, I wouldn't have. But when they humiliated my daughter, they gave me a reason to stop protecting them. That night, after tucking my little girl into bed again, I pulled out my laptop a second time. This time, I didn't just write to record the pain. I wrote with purpose, gathering every detail, every scrap of evidence, every piece of information I still had access to. The game had changed. They thought they had embarrassed my child for a few hours, but they had no idea they had awakened a storm that had been building for years inside me. I started piecing everything together. Old emails my husband had once forwarded to me by mistake, spreadsheets I had glimpsed when helping him with paperwork, conversations I had overheard at dinners when the men thought I wasn't really listening. I remembered numbers, names, dates. I had always had a good memory, and now I realized how much of their arrogance I had absorbed quietly, never realizing one day it would become my weapon. I wasn't reckless. I didn't plan to run into the street shouting accusations. No, I was patient. I began carefully building a timeline of their business practices, cross-referencing things I knew with public records. It was astonishing how sloppy they had been, how much they had relied on the assumption that no one would ever look closely because they had money, charm, and social standing. But I looked closely. Every evening, after my daughter went to bed, I sat at that same kitchen table and turned my silence into strategy. And with every detail I uncovered, my anger sharpened into something precise, something unstoppable. Meanwhile, word about the party began to ripple through the school community. At first it was whispers, but then one of the mothers, someone I had never spoken to much before, pulled me aside at pickup. She told me she saw what happened, that she was ashamed she hadn't spoken up, and that I wasn't alone. That small gesture fueled me more than she'll ever know, because it meant people were watching, and it meant the perfect facade the hostess had built wasn't as bulletproof as she believed. My daughter slowly began to heal, though the bruise on her confidence was still there. I saw it when she hesitated, before walking into class, when she second-guessed her clothes in the morning. And every time, I reminded her that what happened said nothing about her and everything about them. But I also promised myself, that I would make sure those people understood the cost of their cruelty. They wanted to measure us by dresses and appearances. Fine. I would show them what real value looked like, and how quickly their world could unravel when someone they underestimated refused to stay silent. It was almost ironic how their arrogance became the very thing that made it so easy for me to gather proof. They bragged in plain sight, lavish purchases that didn't line up with their reported income, donations made under the table to secure favors, contracts awarded to friends whose companies barely existed on paper. They never expected anyone like me to notice. They thought I was invisible, a quiet mother in a modest dress, someone who didn't belong in their world. That invisibility became my strength. I reached out to an old friend of mine who worked in accounting. I didn't tell her everything at first, only enough to ask a few hypothetical questions. She confirmed what I already suspected. There were irregularities in the financial patterns I described. Big ones that, if brought to the right people, could no longer be ignored. Every night, I felt myself becoming more focused, more deliberate, like all the years of humiliation had sharpened into a single blade. During the day, I stayed calm, normal, almost forgettable. I walked my daughter to school, smiled at the other parents, let them think I had dropped the matter, let them whisper. But inside, I was already 5 steps ahead. And then, without warning, the hostess herself gave me more ammunition. She called me one evening, pretending concern, her voice syrupy sweet as she said, "I hope your daughter is doing better. You know how children are? Sometimes they exaggerate." That single sentence lit a fire in me. Exaggerate? My daughter's tears had soaked into my blouse. Her humiliation was seared into her memory. And this woman dared to call it an exaggeration. I didn't argue with her. I didn't raise my voice. I simply thanked her for calling, hung up, and added another note to my growing file. Pattern of dismissing harm. Gaslighting behavior. It might not have been financial fraud, but it painted the picture I needed. Because what I was building wasn't just about money. It was about character, about credibility, about exposing who they really were behind their curated smiles. And once that curtain was pulled back, there would be no way to stitch it closed again. The file on my laptop grew thicker by the day. Scanned copies of receipts, screenshots of emails, notes about conversations, even photographs I found online of their endless luxury trips that didn't match their supposed earnings. Piece by piece, I was building a puzzle, and when the final picture came into focus, it was damning. But I didn't want to act too soon. Timing was everything. One wrong move and they would spin it back on me, play the victims, claim I was bitter or jealous. No, I wanted the truth to be undeniable. Meanwhile, at school, the whispers had shifted. A few parents who once avoided me now stopped to chat, their tone cautious, almost respectful. I realized that the story of the party had spread farther than I expected. People were starting to question the hostess and her family, starting to see cracks in the perfect image they had worked so hard to polish. I noticed how she avoided me at drop-off, her smile stretched too thin, her eyes darting away. That was when I knew she felt it. She didn't know what I was doing, but she could sense that something had changed, that I wasn't the silent shadow she thought I was. One Friday afternoon, as I watched my daughter run into my arms after school, her laughter finally sounding freer again, I made a decision. I would stop collecting and start acting. I reached out to a contact I still had in local journalism, a woman I went to college with who now worked as an investigative reporter. She had always been hungry for stories that exposed hypocrisy, and I knew she would understand the weight of what I was about to share. When I met her at a quiet cafe, I slid a USB drive across the table, my hand steady. "This isn't just about money," I told her. "It's about a family who thinks they can humiliate and exploit without consequence. It's about people who believe they're untouchable. I want the world to see who they really are." She looked at me, eyebrows raised, then nodded slowly, her fingers closing over the drive. And in that moment, I knew the clock had started ticking for them. The waiting was the hardest part, but also the most exhilarating. I went back to my routine, packing lunches, walking my daughter to school, working my shifts, while knowing that any day the story could break. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart raced. My daughter began to smile more easily again, her confidence creeping back little by little. She didn't know the details of what I was doing, only that I had told her, "No one will ever make you feel that small again." And she believed me. A week later, my journalist friend called. Her voice was electric with excitement. "This is bigger than I thought," she said. "Your instincts were right. The documents match other tips we've been chasing for months. With what you've given us, we can connect the dots." She explained that there were already whispers of an investigation, but my evidence was the missing link. She promised me my name wouldn't appear anywhere, that I would stay in the shadows while they put everything into the light. 2 days later, the first article dropped. It wasn't sensational at first, just a careful expose outlining financial irregularities tied to the company with hints of potential fraud. But it was enough. Enough to make people talk, enough to make the hostess's carefully curated social media presence suddenly seem hollow. I saw her at school pick up the next day, and the panic in her eyes was impossible to hide. She looked thinner, her hair not as perfectly set, her smile brittle as porcelain. She avoided me completely, and that avoidance tasted sweeter than any apology could have. But I wasn't naive. This was just the beginning. The articles would build, the investigation would deepen, and slowly the facade she had hidden behind would collapse piece by piece. And while the world judged her, I would be right here, steady, silent, and watching as the consequences she had always thought belonged to other people finally came crashing down on her doorstep. Soon it spread beyond our small town. Larger outlets picked up the story, first local news channels, then regional papers, and finally national coverage. The family name that once carried so much weight was suddenly tied to words like fraud, embezzlement, and tax evasion. I watched it unfold like a slow-motion avalanche, unstoppable once it started. At school, the whispers turned into outright conversations. Parents who had once worshipped the hostess now distanced themselves, pretending they had never been close, erasing evidence of their friendship on social media. The same mothers who once looked at me with pity or disdain now studied me with something else. Curiosity, maybe even fear. Because they knew I had stood up in that living room, and now, weeks later, the powerful family was crumbling. My daughter still didn't know the full extent of what was happening, but she noticed the changes. The girls who had whispered about her dress no longer dared to sneer. Instead, they invited her to sit with them at lunch, suddenly eager to be her friend. I told her gently that she didn't have to forgive them. Not yet. Not until she was ready. She nodded, her eyes brighter than I had seen in weeks. At night, when she slept, I sat alone by the window and thought about how different everything felt. For so long, I had believed we were powerless, that money and status meant control. But all it had taken was one act of cruelty too far, One line crossed, and suddenly their empire was paper thin. They had built their world on appearances, and appearances had betrayed them. As more articles came out, I heard rumors of frozen accounts, investigations by federal agents, and high-level resignations. Their friends scattered, their invitations stopped arriving, their smiles vanished from the places they once dominated. And me? I stayed quiet. I didn't need to boast, didn't need to point a finger and say, I did this. Because deep down, I knew they suspected. And the thought of them lying awake at night, wondering if the woman they had dismissed and humiliated was the one who helped burn their empire to the ground, was more satisfying than any confession could ever be. The cracks widened faster than even I anticipated. Within a month, the hostess's husband was forced to step down from his company to focus on family matters, though everyone knew it was because investors were pulling out in droves. Their mansion, once the backdrop for endless parties and photo shoots, grew eerily quiet. I heard whispers from neighbors about cars repossessed, about late-night shouting matches, about lawyers coming and going at odd hours. It was strange to watch. This family that had treated us like second-class citizens now scrambling to keep their own name out of ruin. My daughter noticed the change too. One afternoon, she came home from school and said, "Mom, the kids don't talk about dresses anymore. They don't talk about who's better. They just play." It struck me that my fight had done more than protect her. It had shifted something larger, something I hadn't even realized was possible. The same parents who once prided themselves on their children's appearances were now terrified of being seen as shallow or cruel. For once, kindness was the currency, not designer clothes. And as for the hostess, I finally saw her again at pickup. She looked defeated. Her hair was pulled back messily. No pearls, no perfect lipstick, no air of superiority. She wouldn't meet my eyes, but I didn't need her to. Her silence was the closest thing to an apology I would ever get, and I didn't crave more, because the truth was, I no longer needed anything from her. I had already won, not by shouting, not by begging, but by showing her and everyone like her that silence is not weakness, and that cruelty, no matter how small it seems, always comes back heavier than you expect. I turned to my daughter, squeezed her hand, and thought, this is the lesson she'll carry, not their rejection, but my response. And that was worth more than any revenge I could have planned. Weeks passed, and the scandal only deepened. Federal agents raided their offices, carrying out boxes of documents and hard drives. Photos of the raid splashed across the news, and suddenly, everyone who had once lined up to be associated with them was scrambling to erase every trace. The hostess's social media went dark. No more glossy photos of champagne toasts, no more posed shots of her daughter in glittering gowns. Just silence. It was almost poetic. She had once used that silence to exile my child, and now it was her prison. My journalist friend kept me updated quietly. "It's only a matter of time before charges are filed," she said. "You've done more than you realize." But I didn't need recognition. The victory wasn't in the headlines. It was in the way my daughter's shoulders straightened when she walked into school, in the way she smiled without second-guessing herself, in the way she believed me when I told her she was enough. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, she asked me, "Mom, will they ever be mean again?" I thought for a moment before answering. People like that might always try, sweetheart. But the difference is now, you know they can't win. Not if you remember who you are. She nodded, thoughtful, and leaned against me. That moment meant everything. The downfall of a wealthy family might make the headlines, but this, teaching my daughter resilience, showing her that no one had the right to measure her worth, was the true legacy. And as I held her close, I realized revenge hadn't just leveled them. It had freed us. By the time formal indictments were announced, the community had completely turned its back on them. Parents who once gushed over the hostess at school events now crossed the street to avoid her. Invitations stopped, sponsorships dried up, even the charities she flaunted her generosity through quietly removed her name from their boards. Their family name had gone from a badge of prestige to a whispered cautionary tale. I watched it all from the sidelines, not gloating, not celebrating, just observing. Because in truth, I didn't need to add anything. Their own greed and cruelty were destroying them faster than I ever could. My daughter, meanwhile, had bloomed. She joined an art club at school, something she had been too shy to try before. She wore her favorite dresses proudly, even if they weren't fancy. And every time she walked out the door, I saw more of the light returning to her. One morning, she spun around in a simple yellow dress and asked, "Do you think I look pretty, Mom?" And I told her, "You look powerful?" She grinned at that answer, and I realized it was true. Powerful was better than pretty. Pretty fades, but power grows. The hostess must have felt the same shift, because when I finally crossed paths with her again, she didn't sneer, didn't smirk, didn't say a single word. She just stood there, eyes hollow, clutching her child's hand like it was the only thing she had left. For a brief moment, I almost pitied her. Almost. But then I remembered the sight of my daughter sitting alone in that kitchen, tears slipping down her cheeks, humiliated because of a dress, and the pity evaporated. She had chosen cruelty. She had planted the seed. All I had done was make sure it grew into something she could no longer hide. And as I walked away, holding my daughter's hand, I knew with absolute certainty we would never be the ones in the kitchen again. The indictments shook the entire community to its core, because this wasn't just a scandal whispered behind manicured hedges anymore. It was official, undeniable, stamped with the government's seal. Fraud, embezzlement, tax evasion. The very words that used to circle other people's names in the papers now wrapped themselves tightly around hers, strangling the image she had worked decades to build. I remember seeing her husband's mugshot on the evening news, his arrogant smirk gone, replaced with the hollow stare of a man who finally understood the walls were closing in. I sat there in my modest living room, the same one she had once dismissed as charming in a simple way, and I laughed, not because I enjoyed suffering, but because I knew this was justice, the kind of justice people like her never thought would touch them. My daughter sat beside me, head on my shoulder, and asked if the mean people would have to say sorry now. I didn't know how to explain the law to an 8-year-old, so I told her the truth in words she could hold on to. Sometimes sorry isn't enough. Sometimes people have to pay in other ways. And she nodded, her little brow furrowed in thought, as if she was beginning to understand the world's cruel balance. The weeks that followed were a blur of chaos for them, and quiet strength for us. I heard that their so-called friends abandoned them completely, leaving them to face the storm alone. The charity events where she once preened and posed went on without her, and the same women who had whispered about my daughter's dress now whispered about her bankruptcy filings, her frozen accounts, her children being pulled out of private school. They didn't whisper because they cared. They whispered because vultures always circle when the mighty fall. And every time I overheard one of those conversations, I thought back to that day in the kitchen, to my daughter's wide, tear-filled eyes, and I reminded myself why I started this. It was never about revenge in the way they would paint it. It was about dignity, about teaching my child that we don't sit quietly in the corner when people try to make us small. And then one morning, as we were leaving the house, I saw her pause at the mirror in the hallway. She smoothed down her simple blue dress, looked at herself, and instead of asking me if she looked nice enough, she whispered to her own reflection, "I look strong." My throat tightened, and I had to blink hard to keep the tears back. That was it. That was the moment I knew it had all been worth it. The sleepless nights, the risk of exposing powerful people, the fear of retaliation. She wasn't carrying my scars. She was carrying her own armor. And as I held her hand on the walk to school, sunlight breaking through the trees, I realized that while their empire was collapsing into dust, we were just beginning to build something stronger. A legacy of truth, resilience, and the quiet, unstoppable power of refusing to bow down. By the time their trial date was announced, the community barely recognized them anymore. The family that once set the standard for every school event and neighborhood gathering had become a warning, a whispered example of how quickly arrogance turns to ash. Their mansion went up for sale, though no one seemed eager to touch it, and their children, once paraded around in sparkling clothes, were now shielded from the public eye, their mother shuffling them in and out of school like a ghost of who she once was. I could have gloated. I could have marched right up to her and demanded she look me in the eye, demanded she acknowledge what she had done to my child. But the truth was, I didn't need to. I had already won, not because her life had fallen apart, but because mine had blossomed. My daughter now walked into school with her chin high, her laughter ringing out without hesitation. She joined the chorus, she made friends who cared about her spirit instead of her shoes, and she never once asked me again if her dress was good enough. She had learned something far greater than social approval. She had learned that her worth was untouchable. As for me, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I had carried for years. All the times I had been quiet, all the moments I had endured condescension, all the times I had told myself it was easier not to fight back. They were behind me now. I had found my voice, and once found, it could never be silenced again. Saumyu. Evening. As I tucked my daughter into bed, she looked at me sleepily and said, "Mom, I'm glad you didn't let them win." Her words were simple, but they went straight to my heart. I kissed her forehead and whispered, "We'll never let anyone put us in the kitchen again." And I meant it. The hostess and her family might have thought they had the power to define us, But in the end, their cruelty only revealed their weakness. Ours was the quiet revenge, the kind that didn't need shouting or spectacle, the kind that let the truth do the work, while we walked forward hand in hand into a life no longer shadowed by their judgment. The day the verdict came down, I didn't even watch it on television. I didn't need to. By then, their downfall was no longer my story to follow. It belonged to the courts, to the reporters, to the same neighbors who once bowed to them and now shook their heads in disgust. Instead, I spent the afternoon in the park with my daughter. She was running through the grass with a ribbon in her hair, laughing so freely it made strangers smile, and I thought to myself, this is the only verdict I care about. Her joy, her freedom, her confidence. That was the true sentence passed down, not on them, but on the scars they had tried to leave on her heart. And as I sat there, watching the golden light of the setting sun wrap around her like a promise, I realized that revenge hadn't consumed me. It had freed me. It had transformed me from the woman who once bowed her head to keep the peace into the woman who now stood tall, unafraid of consequences. People in town still whispered, of course. They whispered about how quickly the mighty had fallen, about who had helped it happen, about whether I had played a role. I never confirmed or denied a thing. That was part of the power, leaving them to wonder, leaving them to feel the weight of my silence in the same way they once forced silence onto me. And in the quiet of those evenings, when my daughter curled against me and drifted to sleep, I thought about how cycles can end, how cruelty passed down from adults to children can be broken if just one person decides enough. That's what I had done. I hadn't just defended her from a single humiliation. I had rewritten the story of who we were allowed to be. And when I finally closed my eyes that night, I felt a peace I hadn't known in years. Because I understood now, real revenge isn't loud. It doesn't need fireworks. Real revenge is watching the world that tried to crush you collapse under its own weight, while you and your child rise above it, stronger than ever, untouchable. Months later, the echoes of their downfall were still rippling through the community. Their mansion sat empty, its once manicured lawns overgrown, the gate rusting in spots where no gardener came anymore. Some people said they moved to a smaller town, others claimed they were hiding with relatives until the appeals ended. I didn't care enough to find out. They had become a ghost story. One people told in hushed voices at dinner tables, a reminder of how fragile power really is when it's built on arrogance and cruelty. My daughter and I had built our own new rhythm. Saturdays were for farmers, markets, where she picked out flowers to brighten our kitchen table. Evenings were for reading together, her head tucked against my arm. She began sketching dresses in her notebook, not because she wanted to impress anyone, but because she loved the colors and patterns. She told me one day she wanted to design clothes for girls like her, girls who wanted to feel beautiful without needing a price tag to prove it. My heart swelled, because she had taken what was meant to break her and turned it into a dream. And me? I finally let myself breathe. I stopped replaying the cruelty of that day in the kitchen. Instead, I started savoring the strength it gave me, the boundaries it forced me to draw, the lesson it carved into my bones. Sometimes at school events, I'd catch other mothers watching me, curiosity in their eyes, maybe even respect. A few had quietly apologized for their silence at the party, and while I didn't forget, I accepted. Because I wasn't living in the shadows of that humiliation anymore. I was living in the light of what came after. And every time my daughter ran across the playground with her laughter ringing in the air, I thought to myself, this is the ending. They never saw coming. Not their ruin, but our rise. The final chapter of this story didn't come in a courtroom or a headline, though both of those things marked the family's permanent fall from grace. No, the true ending unfolded slowly, like the steady opening of a flower, in all the quiet ways our lives began to flourish once we no longer lived under the weight of their judgment. Months had turned into a year, and the once feared hostess had vanished entirely from our social circles. Her mansion sold at a loss, her husband's name struck from business directories, her children pulled into the shadows of anonymity. Everything they had clung to so desperately, gone like smoke in the wind. People occasionally brought them up in conversation, but not with awe or envy anymore. Now they were spoken of as a cautionary tale, with that mix of pity and scorn reserved for those who fly too close to the sun and then act surprised when they burn. And though I heard those whispers, they no longer had power over me. I didn't live for their stories anymore. I lived for mine. For us. My daughter had grown in ways that stunned me daily. The little girl who once cried quietly in a kitchen corner had become a beacon of self-assurance. She joined school plays, even singing in front of crowds, her voice shaky at first, but stronger every time. She wore the dresses she loved, sometimes simple cotton, sometimes something she decorated, herself with ribbons and fabric paint, and she walked into those rooms like she belonged, because she finally believed she did. And the best part, she didn't just believe in herself, she started believing in others. I watched her comfort classmates who were left out, offer her seat to shy kids at lunch, defend a boy who was teased for his old shoes. She became the protector I once had to be for her, and that was how I knew the cycle had been broken. She didn't learn cruelty, she learned courage. For me, the transformation was quieter, but just as profound. I stopped apologizing for who I was. I stopped feeling the need to measure myself against the shine of people who had nothing beneath their polish. I took a promotion at work that I had been too nervous to pursue before, because I no longer cared whether others thought I fit the image. I began reconnecting with friends I had lost touch with, people who valued authenticity over appearances. And in the evenings, after long days, I found joy in the simplest things. Cooking dinner with my daughter humming beside me, planting herbs. In our small garden, laughing over burnt cookies, watching the seasons change outside our window. Those ordinary moments became extraordinary because they were ours, free from the shadow of comparison. One spring afternoon, about a year after the infamous birthday party, my daughter and I were invited to another classmate's celebration. I hesitated at first, memories of that kitchen clawing at me, but she begged me with bright eyes, and I agreed. When we arrived, I braced myself, half expecting the old judgment to creep back in, but instead, I was met with warmth. Parents smiled genuinely, children played without glancing at labels on clothes, and my daughter darted into the crowd with confidence I had never seen before. I stood there for a long moment, taking it in, realizing that the atmosphere itself had changed. Maybe my confrontation hadn't just shifted something in us, it had shifted something in them too. The days of exclusivity and silent cruelty were crumbling, replaced by a new understanding. No one wanted to end up like hers. I watched my daughter laugh with her friends, frosting smudged on her cheek. I felt a swell of peace that nearly brought me to tears. I thought back to that awful day when she sat exiled in a kitchen, tears running down her small face, convinced she wasn't good enough. And now here she was, in the center of the room, radiating light. That was my real revenge. Not the investigations, not the scandals, not the headlines. My revenge was her happiness, her resilience, the unshakable truth that we had not only survived their cruelty, but risen far above it. Walking home that evening, my daughter skipped along the sidewalk, holding my hand tightly. "Mom," she said suddenly, "do you think people will ever forget what happened?" I squeezed her hand, smiling softly. "Maybe, but we don't need them to forget. We just need to remember who we are." She nodded thoughtfully, her little face glowing in the streetlights, and I realized that was the final lesson I wanted to leave her with. We didn't need erasure. We needed memory, the kind that doesn't hold you down, but holds you up. So no, there was never a dramatic showdown in front of the whole town, no shouting match in a courtroom, no one begging for forgiveness on their knees. My revenge was quieter, deeper, more permanent. It lived in the way my daughter no longer questioned her worth. It lived in the way I stood taller, unafraid of disapproval. It lived in the silence of those who once mocked us, but now avoided our eyes. And it lived in the hollow ruins of a family who thought their power was eternal, until one small girl in a cream-colored dress reminded them how fragile empires really are. That is the ending. Not their fall, but our rise. Not their punishment, but our freedom. And as I tucked my daughter into bed that night, her sketches of dresses scattered across her desk, I whispered a promise as much to myself as to her. Never again will we be the ones locked away in the kitchen. We belong in the light always,